panel of the third day of the Social Vision Conference. This panel will be focused on socio-mystical justice and incarceration. It'll start right after I finish speaking, but just before we get started, I want to remind everyone to join us tomorrow for our education day, which has, I believe, 4 panels of really, really awesome speakers, and then it'll be capped off by the keynote lecture by Professor Wolfson. And then again on the following Monday for kind of closing out a few remarks and a few more conversations with some big names like Rabbi Tlushkin will be joining us on that day. So please don't miss that. And without further ado, I'll hand it off to Rabbi Binyamin Murray to moderate this panel.
Thank you so much, Jonah. Thank you everyone for coming and attend, and thank you to our panelists for taking the time to speak with us. As was said, my name is Binyamin Murray. My wife and I are shluchim, emissaries of the Lubavitcher Rebbe here in Middlebury, Vermont. My wife is also the owner of New Moon Physical Therapy and Wellness, a new venture she's just starting. Earlier today, Rabbi Lipsker from the Aleph Institute spoke about his background working with prisons and the prison system and working on reforming the prison system. And I'm very excited to hear of the panelists this evening, kind of continue that conversation and to hear their unique perspectives. Just to kind of one statistic that stuck out to me from Rabbi Lipsker is that 1 in 10 of all of us know someone or have some connection to a person who's within the prison system. It's a huge number. Since he began working in this field in 1981, there's been a 3-fold increase in the prison industry in our country. The impacts, the collateral damage of the prison system is really astounding. If you think of it at a societal level, how many people are impacted from that one incarcerated individual. And we'd like to kind of begin our panel speaking to Roxanne Formey, who has served since 2018 as the judge and court administrator and clerk of the Court of the Magistrate in Chatham County in Georgia, and while serving as a pro-term judge for the Juvenile Court in Chatham County. In 2020, she was elected to the Juvenile Court judge in Chatham County, and she has aided numerous humanitarian causes and domestic violence prevention organizations with legal assistance, and continues to volunteer with organizations dedicated to community development and human rights. And as Rabbi Lipsker pointed out, this cycle of children becoming involved in the prison system because of choices that were made generations ago, and that there's been this chain reaction of people continuing to have involvement with the prison system. So Roxanne, with that, I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this panel, and I'm honored to be here. I was asked to speak a little bit about what I do as a juvenile court judge as it relates to the Social Vision book and youth, and so that's what I will focus on today. The specific chapter that I wanted to point to is chapter 6 of the book, and the chapter talks about criminal justice, poverty versus affluence, and how we address crime. And the restorative justice movement, as we know it today, has largely been led by juvenile justice reform advocates, which is really important to note. We have to know that children are not criminals and should not be referred to in that way. And the language that we use around them is really important. We don't talk about convictions and jailed, we talk about delinquency and detainment. We also must remember to treat children like children in our justice system. The fact is that the majority of kids that are in the juvenile justice system are from poorer backgrounds. And the Rebbe does talk about blaming crime on poor as being anti-Torah. Given opportunities to those that don't have them is really important, because you'll see that they'll take pride in the achievement. And this is especially true of our vulnerable youth. The Rebbe also said to focus on what he calls the fundamental ethos rather than the symptoms of the problems. And we have yet to fully do this in our society. The book also references, and we know that crime is largely situational or opportunistic, and that kindness and justice should absolutely be incorporated into all of our educational systems. However, in the juvenile justice system, there's an inherent bias that leads us to believe that crime should be blamed on the poor. We have to adjust our thinking around this. The Rebbe also talks about inculcating a basic sense of responsibility toward God and humanity. And so therefore, schools and other institutions, in my opinion, who directly deal with children need to focus on the inclination of the heart and good character. But the question is how do we do this? And if a child is inundated with the burdens of food and housing insecurity, they're not necessarily interested in what we're trying to teach them in that way. So first, what do? We feed them and we house them. And then we can begin to foster the curiosity and creativity and character development that's spoken about in the book. We have to engage children where they are and encourage them to participate in their own growth and achievement. The book also discusses crime prevention through education, and I think this is really important, but we have to really make sure that we're addressing the basic needs of our kids, and then achievement can come after that. We have to create opportunity and stability in order for there to be success. So detention of our children just really breeds nothing more than preparing them for adult incarceration, and we really need to be careful about that. And one thing that the Georgia state laws have done is they have addressed this problem by codifying the requirement to look for alternatives to detention and least restrictive alternatives. And so in my work, we are always looking for ways to prevent detention and to find a more holistic way to approach the offenses that the child is facing. The Rebbe also seems to affirm this by explaining that punishment through incarceration is not even the Torah way. So we must ask ourselves, what does mass detention of our children actually accomplish? And we must continue to take into account the child brain and its lack of development and the inability of children to fully comprehend the relationship between actions and consequences. And so ask ourselves, are we fostering correction or are we fostering punishment? Our children see it completely as punishment, which is extremely unproductive in trying to direct them in a proper way. Further, there's an idea in the book that crime is a rupture of the fabric of self. And this is a really important point because with many children in the juvenile justice system, it's clear that we as adults have contributed to that rupture of self, and children don't know how to repair themselves. So it's interesting, the statistic that was brought out that in 2016, 7% of children had an incarcerated parent. 29% of the global population are females in America. And this is just staggering, and the number is growing and has a direct impact on the crimes that our children are involved in. And education is absolutely central to this, but how do we incorporate what the Rebbe calls a vertical nature of personhood and the idea of humanity into a secular education? Well, I maintain that adults have a duty to help make children feel like human beings and actually teach them to respect and have compassion for the humanity in other people. And we have to teach them about the greater good. And that means that compassionate judges, teachers, and other adults in their lives have to reinforce these ideas. So this is definitely a difficult task, given that we've allowed the deterioration of our children's lives to go on for so long, but I don't think it's insurmountable. But if we don't tackle it, the souls of these children will be at stake, and the children will increasingly fail to recognize their own humanity, forget seeing it in others. And so in my work, I think that all of these things come into play, and it is incumbent on us to nurture and foster a sense of self and a sense of humanity in order to try to make sure that they don't fall into the criminal justice system as a general matter. So that's my general take on the book and how my work would relate to it. Thank you.
Roxanne, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and comments. It's really appreciated and will add a lot to the conversation. Our next speaker is Professor Elaine Leeder. She's a social science dean emerita and professor emerita of sociology at Sonoma State University. She has 44 years of teaching experience, including work in prisons and with convicted felons. And Leeder was a visiting scholar at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the author of numerous books on incarceration and sociology. And she's also a recipient of the Real Hero Award by the American Red Cross for her prison work. She's also a very distant cousin of the Lubavitcher Rebbe and is honored to be included in the panel since being a Jew in her prison work are core pieces of her identity. And with that, we'd like to turn it over to Professor Leeder, who is sharing her screen, and she'll explain why she's doing that herself. Thank you. Oh, you are muted.
My apologies. Hi, I'm Elaine Leeder. I rarely get an opportunity to use that name. In my secular world, nobody knows who Schneerson is, but this esteemed crowd does, so it's good to be here. I've put on the screen today, as some of you might know, is Holocaust Remembrance Day. And this is my family that was killed in Lithuania. That's my father who made it out in 1939, Zalman Schneersonis, who became Samuel Schneerson. The bottom is my grandmother, Yentalea, my grandfather, Eliezer, for whom I am named, my uncle, Herschel, who was 17 at the time of being killed, and my aunt, Althea. Unfortunately, all of them were marched out to their deaths out of a little village in Kupiskis, Lithuania. My father was able to get out, and here I am. And I was raised Orthodox, and that played a very important role. I was not brought up Lubavitch or Hasidic, but having grown up behind the Mechitza, I felt some inequality. And as a result, I really began to explore alternative ways of being and found my way really wanting to understand, because of my family, the nature of evil. And first I worked with domestic violence, and then with perpetrators of domestic violence. And then ultimately, about 25 years ago, I found my way to prison. And it's a long, circuitous story, but I ended up there. And what I really discovered was much of what the Rebbe said in the book. And I was very moved by what he had to say, because he was very forward thinking in his ideas. And then I think Philip Wexler and Michael Wexler et al. Really made his ideas accessible in a way that I didn't know as a child. And I liked that he was talking about the fact that we are moving out of a cultural chrysalis into something new. And I believe that restorative justice is part of that new paradigm that we're moving towards. And my experience in prison is really that of being in the belly of the beast. And that it is the iron cage at its most awful, in the way that Weber addressed the iron cage and the mechanization of life. I mean, certainly for those of you who have ever been to prison, you know about the uniforms and the lockstep and the chains and the guards and the whole mechanization of humanity, the dehumanization that goes on in that place. Now, one of the things that I really resonated with the Rebbe was that he said that redemption was possible through spirituality. Now, he thought, of course, that it would come through the Torah, but many of the prisoners with whom I work come to redemption through various methods, and I need to address that. I've had Native American prisoners that I've worked with, and African American who've done services out of, or spirituality out of, Africa. And so whatever method that someone can use to reach their highest potential, I have seen happen even in prison, in spite of prison. not because of what's being offered to them. I want to tell you, because I was once a social worker, I tell cases that then illustrate my point. I'm working right now with someone at San Quentin, and he committed a kidnapping. And the victim wrote to him several years ago wanting to communicate. And so I'm doing victim offender dialogues, which are restorative justice based. And recently we were able to communicate between the victims, two victims, and the person who committed the crime. And in that dialogue, he asked deep, remorseful forgiveness for what he had done. And in that moment, it was granted by both victims. And later, the young woman, a child who had been part of the crime, he said to her, "I'm so sorry that I ruined your childhood." And she said to him, "You didn't ruin it. It was merely a speed bump. Later in life, I got a very serious illness, and you helped prepare me for that horrible experience." They have bonded through the religions that both of them practice, through redemption and through the use of restorative justice. So I really could resonate with what the Rebbe said about the possibilities of the redemption that can take place. We talk about incarceration as being a place for punishment, but it is a place, I believe, with alternatives for redemption and atonement. And I've seen that happen over and over and over again. And I've worked out at least 20 cases, and in the ones that are really reparative, that kind of experience takes place. Fortunately for myself, my Judaism really does inform the work that I've done over all of these years. It informs everything that I do. I went to an I.L. Peretz Workers Circle school where I was able to learn all those wonderful socialist Yiddish values that I really believe inform my work and the work of those of us who were Jewish, who were engaged in social justice, meaning the things like tzedakah and tikkun olam. And I really do believe that justice, justice, justice for all is what we as Jews really act on and believe in. And so my life is certainly that of a memorial candle to this family that died in 1939. And I really believe that in terms of confronting evil, that everyone is possible for redemption through the spiritual path that the Rebbe talks about. And I was very touched and moved by it. And just to be honest with you, very proud now to come of that heritage. We all know the statistics of people who are incarcerated, 1 in 17 white men and 1 in 3 black men and 1 in 6 Latinos. White women are 1 in 111 inmates, and black women 1 in 18. And it costs $31,000 a year to incarcerate somebody, money that could well be used in education, which I've seen happen in prison. So I'm looking forward to the discussion that can take place amongst the panelists, and I really thank you for inviting me to participate.
Thank you so much for sharing about your family and your thoughts. Our next speaker, I didn't mention at the beginning, I apologize. Questions were going to be after the three of you speak, and we'll direct them to first Roxanne and then to Elaine. I apologize for not saying that earlier. Our third speaker and panelist is Rabbi Michael Lerner. He's the editor of Tikkun Magazine and the chair of the Network of Spiritual Progressives. He's also the rabbi of Beit Tikkun Synagogue Without Walls and the author of many books, such as his most recent, Revolutionary Love, a political manifesto to heal and transform the world, which was published in 2020. And with that, Rabbi Leeder will give the stage over to you. You are muted. I unfortunately don't have the ability to unmute you.
Well, I'm honored to be part of this panel, and I am not an expert on prisons. I'm taking the invitation was to read that last two chapters of this book, Social Vision. I think Philip Wexler, Eli Rubin, and Michael Wexler have done a magnificent job of revealing to us a view of Menachem Schneerson as a sensitive and caring thinker who supports policies that could really impact the world. And I feel very glad that Tikkun Magazine, which I formed in 1986, was one of the very first publications to promote a different attitude towards accusations, restorative justice. We were on the forefront of promoting those ideas before many people had heard of them. And I think maybe that had something to do with me having had the experience of being in prison just for a few months, although I could have been there for a much longer time, but I was there for contempt of court in a long story, but I'm not going to go into it, to say that the contempt was overturned by the Ninth Circuit, and eventually the charges against me and the 6 other people in what was called the Seattle Seven, growing out of a demonstration against the war in Vietnam, were dropped. But the work of prison reform, it's great to see the degree to which Schneerson has took that up, and in this wonderful book, Social Vision, that Wexler and Rubin and Wexler have developed. And what I saw there was on their presentation, not only in regard to prisons, but in regard to introducing ethical values into the education system, and acting and supporting the understanding that it was often people with the greatest amount of money who were criminals, although criminals who never got charged. But the book is really amazing presentation. So why is this aspect, this progressive aspect of Schneerson's thought, so little known? Chabad are recognized by the Chabadniks are recognized by their efforts to get Jews to put on tefillin and their love of the Jewish people. But in the years I davened at Chabad synagogues or heard their teachings, no one ever approached me with an invitation to go to a demonstration or write a letter to elected officials about bringing spiritual values into public education, or to support U.S. from moving away from reliance on fossil fuels, which is also mentioned in this in the book on Schneerson. Why was that? Why, in fact, did so many Chabad influenced voters, the ones at least that I've spoken to even recently, embraced a right-wing politics and explained that this was based on Torah claim that human beings are naturally evil and need to be constrained? Well, I have 2 possible hypotheses. One, that Schneerson's pragmatism, his pragmatic side, conquered his prophetic side. Or 2, that he found it hard to find allies either in the right or the left, and so retreated from trying to get his movement to embrace a politics of compassion and what I call a politics of meaning, or what I now call in my latest book, revolutionary love. I understand these problems in my national bestseller called The Left Hand of God, I laid out a strategy on how liberals and progressives could be far more successful if they embraced a new bottom line. The new bottom line would replace the old bottom line that is dominant in the world of work and in the consciousness of so many people who in that world judge efficiency, rationality, productivity by how much money and power they produce for the owners of the corporations and their allies in the media that they own or the educational systems on whose boards they sit. Instead, our educational system, we need for all of both for the educational system, but for the world of work and more generally for our society, a new bottom line. And that's why we formed an organization called the Network of Spiritual Progressives to promote this idea that our educational system, our cultural systems, our corporations, our economy should be judged efficient, rational, and productive, not primarily to the extent that maximize money and power, but to the extent that they contribute or to creating or supporting people to be more loving and kind, generous, forgiving, and grateful, environmentally sensitive, and responsible, seeing other human beings as not through the lens of what can they do for me to meet my needs, but rather seeing everyone as an embodiment of the sacred. Every human being is an embodiment of the sacred. And looking at the universe and the earth, not from the standpoint of, gee, I wonder if there's something here I can turn into a commodity and sell, but rather from the standpoint of awe and wonder and radical amazement at the grandeur and mystery of this universe. That's a very different bottom line. And if we had that bottom line, our society would very quickly look very differently. I believe that until the progressive forces embrace this new bottom line and join with us, Tikkun Magazine, the Network of Spiritual Progressives, and hopefully, I'd like to see someday Chabad being in the leadership of this kind of consciousness and putting that right at the center of the discourse so that every single, the shaliach of Chabad saw his or her responsibility to promote a new bottom, this kind of a new bottom line. And by the way, I love them. all of the shlichim I've met, wonderful people and so forth, but never addressing this kind of societal transformation that's so badly needed. We could reach the heart of people in a different way than the liberal and progressive movements do. Those movements are very good at specific programs to alleviate some of the suffering, but they're not so good at having a vision of a world that we need. They rarely articulate it. That doesn't mean that the people who are in there don't have that. Many, many people do have come to liberal and progressive political movements precisely because they wanted a world based on love and kindness and generosity, but they never say this because they think that this is going to seem too wishy-washy or too woo-woo or whatever their words for it. They need a spiritual and religious education themselves to be able to recognize that huge numbers of people who respond to religion and are responding to it not because of wanting to be controlling and dominating, but because they'd like to have a different kind of world, a fundamentally different kind of world. And until those movements are able to speak to the hearts of people in this kind of way, and help build a movement, a transformative movement based on a new bottom line, I don't think many of the other important changes that, for example, the changes in the way that we orient towards crime and people who are in prison is going to change. Now, what I discovered is that there is a significant section in the Democratic Party, and even many who love Bernie Sanders, who still believe that they will be far more effective if they don't appear to be challenging the bottom line of capitalist society. Well, that's why we at Tikkun, Tikkun is a Hebrew word, it means heal, repair, and transform. Okay, we at Tikkun have been pressing for a different kind of public life, and what we call a post-socialist life, because the socialist vision has very good for economic issues and political rights, but very little in the way of treating human beings as embodiments of the sacred, or responding to the earth with awe and wonder and radical amazement at the grandeur of creation. That has to be part of our public life, not simply something that we do privately. So though Sneerson opposed materialism and selfishness in our society, he never really understood that those in our that the frameworks are deeply rooted in the capitalist marketplace. The frameworks of selfishness and materialism is critically rooted in the capitalist marketplace, and that it will never yield a world in which spiritual and ethical values take first place in shaping our daily realities, as long as that as the capitalist mentality is maintained. Yes, I know that for decades people have despaired of changing the big picture, have advanced change one person at a time, but that change hasn't actually happened. It's happened, at least it's happened, it may have happened to individuals, but it hasn't happened in terms of changing the society. So I would say if you looked at the 2020 election and compared it with previous elections or the 2016 election, you would not turn around and say, wow, look what's happened in America. So many people have embraced a world of love and kindness and generosity and awe and seeing other human beings as embodiments of the sacred. That's not what's happened. It hasn't happened, and it won't happen unless there is a mass movement that embodies it. That's what I'm hoping for Chabad. So in my invitation to anyone who is part of a Hasidic movement or any other religious movement is this: don't be realistic. Everyone around will tell you, if you hear this kind of idea of a new bottom line, will say, "Oh, it's so unrealistic. You know, let's focus on what we can achieve." And here's something something important we can achieve. And in the last two speakers, I totally honor what they've been doing. I don't counterpose it in any way to what they've been doing. I think what they've been doing is terrific. I'm saying, in addition to all the specific things, specific causes that we have, we need to advance a new bottom line and a new vision of the world that we want. And when people tell you it's so unrealistic, let me tell you, that's the exact same thing they said when Martin Luther King Jr. started saying, let's end segregation. It's the same thing that they said when the women's movement started to say, let's fight for an end to male domination in the society. It's the same thing they said when people thought that it was possible to end apartheid in South Africa. It's the same thing that people have said over and over again. It can't happen because of the power relationships. But so it's unrealistic. Well, I'm saying to you that being a Jew means being unrealistic. Okay, don't be realistic. Be unrealistic. It took 10 plagues for Moses to succeed in getting the Israelites to get out of slavery, and that was only, according to at least one of the midrashim, says that only 20% of all the slaves, of the Israelite slaves, actually went out of Yetziat Mitzrayim, went out of went out of Egypt. The other 80% still couldn't believe in the possibility of fundamental transformation. I'm saying our task, along with all the good work that we're doing here and all the good work that Chabad is doing, it's critical that we move to articulate a vision of the world and then insist on its importance and centrality that people will dismiss as unrealistic. So don't be realistic. That's what Jews have always been about, and that's this. I think we need to embrace a highest vision of a world of love, kindness, generosity, and awe and wonder at the grandeur of the universe, and make it the center of our discourse. So thank you for the opportunity to share this with you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Lerner, for sharing your thoughts in those words. And indeed, salvation can come in the blink of an eye. So we should be unrealistic in our expectations of how quickly a change could come. Does anyone have questions amongst the panelists for each other before we open it up to other questions? Yes, feel free to.
I don't know that I have a question, but I just want to say I could really resonate to the idea of spiritual progressivism. And to me, it sounds like Martin Buber's I-thou relationship with each other and not just I-it. And I think as we think about how to implement spiritual progressivism, we also have to understand that prisons and juvenile justice systems are an economic institutions. They are profitable. That's why they're growing. That's why people are incarcerated. It makes money. So we have to get pragmatic while we're talking about being spiritual and progressive. And I think Jews actually understand that very deeply, having been victimized for so many years. That's what I wanted to say.
Beautiful. And we definitely have been inspired by Buber and I-thou relationships, but we also by my mentor at the Jewish Theological Seminary, Abraham Joshua Heschel.
Yes.
Yes. So thanks. Oh, and spiritualprogressives.org. If you want to learn more about what we're doing there, spiritualprogressives.org. Look it up.
Thank you. Any other reflections or comments, or in Hebrew we say ha'ara, like something to add? Roxanne, please go ahead.
Just wanted to acknowledge the point about not being realistic. I think that too often, especially with our children, we address issues in a very boxed in cookie cutter way, and we expect results by doing different results by doing the same thing. So I definitely resonate with that don't be realistic comment. So thank you for that.
One thing that Rabbi Lipsker had brought up in the earlier panel was he did an unofficial study where he asked people he was in touch with if you could go to sleep for your prison term for the next 10 years. And then you would wake up in 10 years and, obviously we don't know how long anyone's going to live for. Would you rather just go to sleep, which is equivalent to, cryogenic freezing or not being alive? You go to sleep, it's a 1/60th of death for this time, and then it's going to be over. So there's the lived time experience of being in prison. There's the mechanical, the clock time. And so I said, for sure, let's just fast forward 10 years, I'll wake up and you let me out. Who wouldn't want to do that? So it just shows that there's been such advances in the prison system in some ways. There's air conditioning, there's better nutrition programs. But Rabbi Lipsker pointed out the training to be a prison guard is how to control people, how to dehumanize people. There's not training on how to work with them, the restorative education. Roxanne, I think you brought this up and illustrated this a lot with what you were saying in the children's justice system, this kind of repetitive nature of this prison enterprise that has been created in our country. So what are some things that could be done? Rabbi Lerner had brought up a point that he doesn't see many shluchim going out to protests, and he doesn't see them making letter campaigns. And I'm not going to put in my 2 cents of why that is. I'd like to hear from you. If from your perspective, if you see what Chabad accomplished, for example, in the Soviet Union, it wasn't through public campaigns. It was through really soft or underground, you could call it soft diplomacy, underground diplomacy, and working on the inside without making a storm, without making a big tumult in the world, of showing everyone what's going on. What do you think, in your opinions, what's the best approach to kind of push the envelope, to move things forward, to be unrealistic in our expectations and dreams of what things could be done, and also to be realistic in our approach in some ways of how to accomplish it?
You're asking all of us?
An open question.
All right. Well, I'll jump in because, you know, I used to call myself an anarchist. I was outside the mainstream, and having now worked inside it, I think one has to be a guerrilla, G-U-E-R-I-L-L-A, guerrilla in the bureaucracy. That there are those people, and I know them, even prison guards, who somehow have learned about the humanity. I don't think it's going to destroy the system. I don't think we're going to bring down the prison industrial complex in our lifetimes. But we can plant the seeds sort of insidiously and quietly. I've watched guards see the victims come out after a dialogue and see the transformation of both victim and the person who committed the crime. And I think it comes from education, just like our prisoners need to be educated and brought to their humanity, so too with the guards. And often they're left behind when any of these social justice programs come in. They don't address the guards or the administration. They deal with the prisoners, and there's resentment. Why are they getting an education and we're not? And so I think being a guerrilla in the bureaucracy is the way that I have finally learned how to function in a very destructive world, because otherwise I would just be overwhelmed and despair with what I see in prisons and in society. So that's my response to your question.
Thank you.
I'll chime in. I think that both approaches are very important. I think that in society, we have to educate our fellow individuals about the type of language that they use, about the internal biases that they harbor, and really talk about the things that reinforce the negative stereotypes and the negative impression of those who are incarcerated or detained as children. I definitely agree with Elaine that sort of the inside work is very important, but I think both things have to work simultaneously in order to make that cultural shift and be able to move towards a more healthy society overall.
Thank you.
And I'll just add that there's no place, no strategy that is the wrong strategy. If you have in mind that you're trying to build a world based on love, kindness, and generosity, and environmental sensitivity, and awe and wonder at the grandeur of the universe, and treating other human beings as embodiments of the sacred, any place that you do it will have a positive impact. So I want to congratulate the other two panelists for the beautiful work that they are doing, and charge Chabad, which is an organization that has the capacity to bring a message to the world, that Chabad should be bringing this message to the world, along with all the other wonderful things it does.
But I'm curious, and this is really a question for you, Binyamin. Is that part of Chabad's mission? I mean, it seems broader than anything I've ever conceptualized for Hasidim. What
Rabbi Lerner just outlined?
Yeah.
It's an absolutely fundamental piece. Our Hasidus views that our mission, each individual's mission, is to turn over the world to make the world a dwelling place for godliness. Obviously, we're describing godliness as human rights, women's rights, equality, justice, that the world should be viewed as the Rebbe spoke about in his first discourse when he accepted the leadership, that the world should be viewed as a garden. Despite we see all of the challenges, that there's tremendous opportunities there, and that God Almighty really looks at the world as a garden. And it's up to, we have the ability to create a dwelling place here down below for godliness, which very much looks like what's outlined in this book, Social Vision. So it's something that every shliach is working on in their own way. I myself am involved with Education Day, which is promoting some of the things that both Roxanne and Rabbi Lerner had touched on. I think, Elaine, if I took down my notes properly, you also mentioned that the importance of education, of a moral education happening in elementary school, in middle school, in high school, that having that type of education, of a moral education, giving space that each child under the instruction of their parents should know that there's a morality in part of your schooling, that schooling isn't for your economic success, that you're not going through these classes so you know how to balance your checkbook and so you know how to buy a house and what mortgage to get, etc., how to make money. If that's what's important, if a child is only taught that that's what's important in life, and that you only behave when the policeman is looking, don't do that. There's a police officer right there. When if the police officer wasn't there, you should. It's okay if you hit someone. It's okay if you steal something. God Almighty is always there. It says in Pirkei Avos, in the Ethics of Our Fathers in the Mission, there's the eye that always sees and the ear that always hears. If we give our children as a society that type of education, the world would look entirely different. If you teach children that the world is a jungle and that everyone's out to get you, then it shouldn't be a surprise that this is the way that the reaction that's coming from that type of approach.
I actually have a question about that, because the Rebbe talks about the chrysalids and how we're moving into a new generation, a new paradigm. And given the nature, and Michael talked about post-socialism, we're not even post-capitalism. And the likelihood in our lifetimes that capitalism is going to be undermined is, pardon the expression, zero, even with this kind of work. So how do we operate within these constraints? I mean, I carve out my little piece of the world, but that's not going to do away with these power structures and economic forces.
I think that's a great question. I think the name of Michael Magazine really is the answer. That the definition of the name, not that the magazine is the answer, but the concept behind it. That we live in a world of tikkun, which means, as one of the websites for the book is interconnectedness, and to say it another way, inter-inclusion. That there's, if we think about the end of capitalism, there's advantages to a capitalist system. There's advantages to one that's based on with more social benefits. If you take a look at interconnectedness.net, there's an outline of how all of these different concepts that we're talking about and touching on in the conference have to work together. That there's milas, there's advantages and chesarons and challenges in each one of the areas. So Michael's getting ready to say something.
No, just to say, first of all, Yasher Koach, the points you've made, very wonderfully put. I just want to say that, number one, a concrete answer to your question is this book that I've just written called Revolutionary Love. And it's about how we could actually transform. But it's not a transformation to a socialist society. It's a transformation to a post-socialist society, one that incorporates some of the specific economic and political programs of the left, but changes it fundamentally by requiring that every one of those programs be done in a way that enhances our capacity to be loving and caring and kind and generous and environmentally sensitive and responding to the universe with awe and wonder. All that is put together in this one book called Revolutionary Love. And it's been endorsed by everybody from Cornell West, if you know who he is, to Gloria Steinem, to a very large number of wonderful people. And you could read that if you want to read, just read Tikkun, TIKKUN.org/LJ. LJ stands for Love and Justice. Tikkun.org/LJ. And right there, you can read some of the things that people have said about this book that might give you the inclination to say, you know, it wouldn't be a bad idea if I read it. I promise you that you'll have a lot more answers for how to deal with a transformation of the world if you read that book. Anyway.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add briefly.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to add briefly that, I mean, if we look at every social movement in history, it started off with just a few people with an idea about change, and then it grew and it grew based on the spread of those ideas. And so I think that whenever we're looking at trying to make a social, cultural, economic change, that we have to start small, and bring people in one by one, because each individual person is important and can bring something to that space.
I'd actually like to add to that, because I really think that there is a historical dialectic. Look what just happened on January 6th as an example of that. You know, we have loving kindness and efforts that we have towards being a post-socialist society. And then we have QAnon and the reaction, and the world keeps going back and forth between these forces for good and these forces for evil, if you want to simplify it that much. And that, you know, maybe progress is forward moving with this dialectic, but it's generational. Are we moving towards a better society? Well, I thought so, but not from what I've seen recently. I hate to be realistic, but I think change does happen with a few people, and, you know, and then one spark, a prairie fire grows. It will happen, but it's pretty slow.
It's slow.
Social change.
I also want to say that one of the things you'll see if you read my book, Revolutionary Love, is that it's critical to understand that not everybody who's on the right is a bad person. Actually, that there are many people there who are there in part because they felt disrespected and not given recognition for their life and their lifestyle. And part of that has to do with the way that the liberal and progressive world has had a subtext of religiophobia. It doesn't understand the importance of religious or spiritual experience, and partly because many people on the left have an elitist attitude towards everybody else and say, hey, you know, if they're not with us, they're really bad people. And that has played a big role in moving people. Now, why do I say this? How could I make a claim about what's going on in this world in this way? Well, it turns out I'm a psychologist as well as a rabbi. And I received from the National Institute for Mental Health the honor of being the principal investigator of a major study of the psychodynamics of middle-income working people in this society. And I learned in that, I and a team that worked with me, we interviewed and had groups for thousands of middle-income working people. And we learned that there was a complex set of psychodynamic issues that really revolved around the feeling of people feeling like nobody cares for them, and that the people in the liberal and progressive world don't really care for them, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the sense that they feel terrible about themselves and feel like it's awful. They're deeply into self-blaming, and how to repair that self-blaming is also part of what I talk about in Revolutionary Love. So I'm saying to you, I'm not just spinning this off the top of my head. Okay, as a psychologist, I did this massive massive study. And so anyway, I'm much more optimistic as a result of that, because I know that we could, if the first step in changing people who you're saying are the bad, are the forces of evil, and some of them are. There's certainly 20 to 30% of that population is deeply racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, anti-Semitic haters. But there are an awful lot of other people there, and we need to reach out. First step is to change the liberal and progressive forces so that we have a more empathic and compassionate attitude towards people who are not yet on our side, and an understanding that in part that's because of us, so we need to change how we are. And I say that's all in this book, Revolutionary Love.
Well, I'd like to say that's what restorative justice is all about. We're reaching out to the people who have been cast aside by society and marginalized and victimized and vilified, and saying, you are human. Let us talk to you as another human being, rather than putting you in prison or believing that you should get the death penalty. So we're working with the most extreme, if you will, and finding humanity in those interactions, and the humanity within that all people have. You just have to find it, and it's there. They're not the worst thing they ever did.
Amen.
The Rebbe ended thousands of talks. Almost, it could be that Eli Rubin is on. There's other experts who are much more expert in this than I am. Thousands and thousands of talks were ended with the prayer for the redemption, which is really what we're speaking about here. In other words, to have a society that is based and founded in, there's a free flow, so to speak, of love and justice and compassion for everyone. He also ended thousands of talks with a phrase translated in English that the action is the main thing, that the talking about it, writing about it, lecturing about it is all good, but we have to really take some concrete steps. There has to be action that's followed up with all the discussion. And part of it is to spend some time learning and studying some of the ideas that are in this book, some of the other ideas that are in interconnectedness.net, and also with Michael Lerner's book and others who are writing in this area, to try to bring the collective level of consciousness to the place where we can see that this is really where we have to be. There's no question about it, that this is where we have to be, to treat human beings humanely, that this is just an unacceptable thing. From the Torah perspective, there's not the prison. A prison is something that's a very temporary thing. When a court proceeding is happening, and it should be a very quick trial, and there's fines and there's other punishments that are meted out, but to languish in prison for months or years waiting for a trial, that's not what we're in the world to do, is to sit in a box and not be able to interact with our families and not be able to, it's crazy. It's really crazy. So we have to feel that this is a crazy system with a truthfulness, that this has to change. And when we have that feeling that this has to change, not only that, but what we're looking out in the world, the challenges that we see, they're there for us to excel. They're not there as a limitation, not there to hold us back, but it's an opportunity for growth. And that has to come from a very deep place and a lot of thinking over of the concept, to realize that this immense tragedy that I just experienced is really ultimately for the good. And Elaine, you commented on this with some of your work of that one young survivor who said that this terrible event prepared me to overcome a challenge that I faced later in life. And then to have in the front of our minds that the world is really, truly a garden, and that I have it in my power, just like each of you do, to make it a better place. And I'd like to give each one of you if you want to close out with a 30 to 60 second remark, I want to give you time to do that. Just also want to note that Michael Wexler said this has been an amazing discussion, and it's very inspiring. Thank you, Michael, for the feedback. Would anyone like to add in a last word?
Well, I can say something very quickly, which is Yasher Koach to you, Binyamin, and Yasher Koach to Philip Wexler and to Michael Wexler, and to all the people who've put this thing together and who've written this very valuable book, and to all of you who work in the Chabad movement. Yasher Kochechem, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your kind words.
I concur with Rabbi Lerner, all that he said, definitely. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this discussion, and I hope that we can all in the future work together to try to create that restorative change in our justice system and in our world. So thank you, and thank you to the authors.
And I'd just like to add that I'd really like to invite both the audience and all of us to participate in this kind of work together, particularly for me as it relates to juvenile justice and restorative justice in prisons, because the movements are very small and they need to grow larger and larger before we can effectively make a change in this most awful system. So thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome. Thank you to all our panelists for taking the time to speak with us, and to all the attendees in the Zoom and everyone looking at us from the live stream. Jonah, you're going to come back? Yeah.
Thanks so much, Binyamin. That was everyone who just spoke. That was such a great panel. I really enjoyed listening to you all talk, and you all brought so much beautiful Torah to this topic. So I agree, this is a very pressing issue, and it was great to hear all of these three very different perspectives, but overlapping and really pointing towards the same truth. So thank you all for joining us, and Binyamin, thank you for moderating beautifully as always. I want to invite everyone who's made it to the end of day 3 with us to join us for day 4 tomorrow. And I'll just tell you what's happening tomorrow. Tomorrow's our education day, and we start at 11 with a panel on reimagining education. And then at 12 with a panel called Path to Utopia Today, Social Vision and Economic Questions. And then at 1, these are all back to back. At 1, we have Higher Education, Elevating Transformational Learning and Personal Development. And then our keynote lecture at 3 with Professor Elliot Wolfson is called In the Footsteps of the Footsteps, Retrieving the Future and Anticipating the Past. Sorry, couldn't get that out for a second. And so please come join us tomorrow morning at 11. And then again on Monday after Shabbos and after the weekend for our Looking Forwards Day, and a few more conversations with some other prominent voices. So we're very much looking forward to seeing everyone again, and thank you so much for joining us for day 3. Good night or morning, depending on where you are.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.